theoretical ethics and practical ethics. And what I want to deal with are certain cases where you seem to have a pretty straightforward theoretical ethic. It seems to be a very straightforward black and white ethic. And then when you really see through the analysis of Jewish law, you get to a conclusion in law which is very different, and therefore you have to start dealing with the ethical consequences of what you're really being said. So the example that I gave to Corinne to put in the email was the example from the Gemara in Makos. It says throughout the Chumash about the death penalty, right? This over here, mochumat, get killed for this, get killed for that, and so forth and so forth. So you have a statement being made in the Mishnah in Makot that says that Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Tarfon said that if they were ever on a court, they would never execute anyone. Okay? Then Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, if you did that, you increase the amount of murderers in the Jewish people, in the Jewish nation. Okay? So the point is, though, is that they're having an argument over the deterrency of capital punishment. Okay, Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Tarfon are saying, listen, we don't think that capital punishment is worthwhile deterrent. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is saying yes, it is. That's one argument. But the truth is the big problem is you have in the Chumash that for violation of certain laws, you're supposed to face the death penalty. And the truth is that it's incumbent on the court to carry out that death penalty. It's a mitzvah. It's always a mitzvah on a court to carry out the death penalty. Okay? So the point is, certain death penalties, whatever. So the point is, how can Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon say, I'm not going to do this mitzvah? I can always get out of doing this mitzvah. That's what they're effectively saying. They're saying that if I was on a Bezdin, I would never carry out this death penalty. I would never do this mitzvah. Good. Now, the point is, yeah.
Isn't the object though to find a way not to?
Well, that seems to be what Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon are saying. That there's a value, but we have to say.
So they would go to the nth degree.
So the fact. So the point is, they're saying there's a value in not doing the mitzvah, even though there's a mitzvah to do it.
Well, they would still be. It would still be implied that they would, have this mitzvah incumbent on them, and they would still be obligated if, for some reason, they were not zoche to find the way.
Okay, but the way you're defining it is like this: is that there's a mitzvah to do this. Okay, so the question arises: if there's a way to get around doing the mitzvah, so don't have to do the mitzvah. So let's give a case where you have to. So you can look at it in terms of wearing tzitzis, right? If you don't put on a four-cornered garment, you don't have to wear tzitzis. So they're saying, I never put on a four-cornered garment, so I never had to do this mitzvah. Okay, let's give another example. Let's think of an example. Let's take for example the giving of Meiser. In order to have the chiyuv to give Meiser, okay, the tithing from the crop, you have to bring the crop into your granary, okay? In other words, you have to bring it through the door, okay, into your place. If you brought it in through the window, you wouldn't have any obligation to give Meiser. So therefore, if you did this, you get around doing it. Okay? So, hey, I have a way to get around doing this. There are a lot of mitzvahs like this. I mean, you look in terms of, there are different cases where you can work out ways to get around it. Most times, people say yes, but you shouldn't try and get around it. Right? You have a way of getting around it, you shouldn't try getting around it. This is a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to do it, so you shouldn't try getting around it. Over here, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon basically is saying I would always figure out a way to get around it. Now, that's nice. So the point is that what's their argument for saying, hey, there's always a way around it? And then how do you deal with the original statement in the Chumash? Chumash says, kill, execute. They're saying, I can always get a way around it. So why does the Chumash always say execute? What's the point of that? If you can always get around it. So what's it in there in the first place? So that's where I come up with the term theoretical ethics and practical ethics. Theoretical ethics seems to be that there's some kind of ethical structure that is theoretical. You look at the statement of the statement that says you should execute. That seems to be theoretical. Look at it, say, hey, it seems to be right to execute. And yet, in practical ideas, somehow you're supposed to get to another conclusion, or you get to another conclusion. I'll never do it. Now, we have other examples of that. But one example is in terms of the iguna, right? The woman who can never remarry. All of a sudden, you have this theoretical statement in ethics that's that we should not. This woman should not remarry because we can't, she's still married, and therefore we can't say she's unmarried, and therefore she's stuck being in a married situation. And we always work out, it seems that there's a big idea of trying to work out a way to always enable them to get remarried, some kind of heter. But so why have this in the first place? Why have a statement of law like this in the first place? That's one example. Another example might be saving a non-Jew on Shabbos. The theoretical law is that you're not allowed to save a non-Jew on Shabbos. Sorry, you're not allowed to mechal Shabbos to save a non-Jew on Shabbos. Okay? Fact is, practically, every Orthodox doctor will tell you that they save non-Jews on Shabbos. So the point is that there's one thing of working out the practical argument. So there's a practical argument. Why are you going to work out the practical argument? But then, what do you do with the theoretical originating statement? In other words, if Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Karfan are always going to come up with a conclusion that you can always basically figure out a way not to execute it, why did the Torah give all these statements about execution? Okay, and if the Torah is making all these statements supposed to execute, where do you get the idea that you're always supposed to find a way around it?
Or you can look at it in a little bit different way.
Yeah.
You can read it from Chesed or from Gvura. If you look from Gvura side, execute. When you look from Chesed side, we say you always give a person a chance to do tshuva. Like this is why you say in Yom Kippur that Hashem waiting for the Rashayim to come back. He doesn't execute them immediately. He let them another year to do tshuva.
What a Kodesh Baruch Hu does is one thing. That's not the way the courts work. The fact of the matter is that that was actually, according to many Meforshim, that was Moshe Rabbeinu's problem with the Makoshes Eitzim.
Right.
The case in the Makoshes Eitzim was he was picking up, he was being Machal Shabbos. He did a violation of Shabbos, and it was clear cut he did it in such a way that he was deserving the death penalty. But Moshe knew that his motivation for doing it was to get killed in order to teach the people how significant Shabbos is. So he was really doing what's called an Avera Lishma, a sin for the purposes of heaven, where he said basically, listen, if I do this and I get executed, people will understand how serious it is to violate Shabbos. So the question is that's everyone Moshe knew his motivation was a good motivation, even though he was wrong. So Moshe said, should I execute him? Okay. You can make the question much more technical. There's other technical, question in halachas of Shabbos, Kufon. I'm not going to get into those details. The point is that Kodesh Baruch Hu told Moshe, listen, Kalpei Shmaya, in terms of me, I know the inner motivation of an individual. So that's up to me. That's my decision. A court does not know the inner motivations of an individual. Courts can only go by the facts. Therefore, he told Moshe, you have to make a decision based upon the facts. Not some kind of knowledge of psychology or whatever it is. What's the facts? He violated Shabbos in such a way, gets killed. So the truth is, the courts have to make decisions like that. Now, the fact is that it might be true that a judge who's stricter versus a judge who's more lenient, it might be a reflection of whether he's more of a Baal Chesed or more of a Baal Gvura and stuff like that. But the fact is that those aren't factors in terms of the decision-making process. So you might want to argue that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon were more Baal Chesed and Shmuel Gamliel was more Baal Gvura. Yeah, you can argue like that. But the point is you still have to deal with how did they technically deal with this. Okay, you have a law that says A, right? How do you deal with the fact that there's this theoretical law? Okay, and the fact is and that's why the question goes beyond this in terms of saving a non-Jew on Shabbos. There you have a theoretical statement of law that seems to be pretty straightforward, and then you have this idea where practically almost everyone works it out and says, listen, we can get around that law. There's other cases like that. By mamzeros, the idea of having an illegitimate child seems to be very straightforward. Someone's a mamzer, and throughout history, we always figure out ways to get around mamzeros. What do you call it? Questions I was mentioning last week about people who can marry or not. I mentioned the fact that if a woman is raped by a non-Jew, she's usher on a Kohen. Okay, even through no decision on her own. She was simply raped, which means that she had no involvement in the decision making. What happens? She's usher on a Kohen because she comes a zona. Because zona is defined by just the very act of having relations with someone you can't marry, and since a Jewess can't marry a non-Jew, therefore that makes her a zona, technical zona. Now, in fact, every rabbi in the world will try and figure out a way. If a woman walked in and said I was raped, right, and this was a case I mentioned by Moshe, where a woman who was engaged was raped, and Moshe worked really hard to figure out a heter to try and get around it. So the point is so what's that law doing there? You have a theoretical law that says A, and then practically you're always going to get around it. And what's the motivation for always getting around it? It seems to be that there's another ethical considerations happening here. Now, the truth of what you're saying between Chesed and Gvura, that's a dialectic. That's a dialectic that exists in Jewish thought that is constantly coming up. The point is how do you deal with this from a theoretical and practical basis? But the fact is that what you find in Jewish ethics is that you have some very seemingly broad ethical statements, sometimes tied to very broad psukim in Chumash, and then you have practical ethics that come out of halacha that seem to challenge those big theoretical laws. I'll go back to the case of the death penalty. It's not just the fact that there was a death penalty, but the Gemara speaks in praise of the fact that a court that killed once in 7 years or once in 70 years was considered to be a hanging court. Well, we got the death penalty, but don't really. But if you do it too often, and too often is once in 70 years, it's not a good thing. So why do you have the death penalty in the statement in the first place? And what are the dynamics of what's happening? This is a somewhat of an issue in Jewish ethics. What really are the ethics? And it becomes somewhat. It's somewhat of a. It also opens up certain, let's say, certain further issues, because you can open up the issues of any further analysis on these ethics and so forth, is that considered to be a movement forward, or is that considered to be a movement that's not forward? Like, for example, let's take the Hecht Shemitah. Okay, the allowance to try and work out a way to work the land of Israel during a Shemitah year. Okay? So, the fact is that there are many great rabbis who were in favor of the Hecht Shemitah, and there were many great rabbis who were very upset about the Hecht Shemitah. Okay? There was a certain amount of that. Now, even those who favored the Hecht Shemitah said it's been used as an emergency power and emergency times, and you should not apply it if you don't have the emergency. So it becomes another issue: are we in a time of emergency or not in a time of emergency? So in the late 1800s, a lot of rabbis said this is a time of emergency, so apply this process to let the Jews work the land of Israel, okay, during the Shemitah year. Other rabbis said absolutely incorrect. This system does not work. This analysis does not work. That was that issue. But nowadays you have many rabbis who sit there and say, listen, back in the late 1800s, it was the emergency type of situation that said, yes, you should apply the Hecht Shemitah. Nowadays, you don't have the same type of emergency, so therefore people should not be applying it. In other words, there's theoretically getting involved in the fact that, yes, it's theoretically applicable. Then comes the issue of when to apply it, when not to apply it. So what you have is a very interesting dynamic. You have the dynamic, you have the broad statement, you have the dynamics of how you can act upon the broad statement to almost circumvent the broad statement, and then what you have is you have the legitimacy of the original circumvention, and then what you have is the statement of the dynamic itself of, well, when is it appropriate to do this or not to do this. And that creates this whole dialogue amongst the people. Are they in Camp A, Camp B, or Camp C? So there's people today who walk around and say the Hecht Shemitah was always wrong. There's other people around who sit there and say, oh, the Hecht Shemitah was right for the 1880s, but in 2014 it's wrong. And there's other people saying we still need it, so it's okay. How do they make these decisions? And how do they feel with the original broad statement and the practical? These are the kind of questions that exist. And in many ways you see this in a lot of issues. It comes up a lot, for example, in terms of women in Judaism, where you'll have arguments where some people will totally disagree with an argument, and other people will sit there and say, the argument is legitimate, however, it's really, you shouldn't be favoring it. Right? So you have all these different types of arguments. Okay. So the point is what you're left with is, it seems to be that there are some broad theoretical ethical statements in Chumash that for one reason or another, some of them become open to further analysis. Almost like a statement that says, yeah, there's that ethical principle, but it shouldn't be applied, or it should only be applied rarely. So how do you deal with the fact of that theoretical statement? Okay, so the first thing that hits you is dealing with ethics. One of the things that happens, or that when people talk about Jewish ethics, is in many ways they look at Jewish ethics as one statement, and they sort of say what they really are saying is, I have this ethical perception, and I can find a source in some pasuk or some source to back up this ethical perception. So you have many times when people will take their own ethic, find a pasuk to back it up, and then just say this is now a Jewish ethic. Yeah.
Well, yeah. How does one, quote unquote, know that this pasuk supposedly would mean this rather than that?
Yeah, that's because a broad statement like that. Like everyone will say, love your neighbor as yourself, right? Yep. So the point is, yeah, you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself. The point is that seems to support a broad ethical principle. So people walk around and say, I'm Jewish, and this is the pasuk I'm going to quote, and it doesn't have to be necessarily a pasuk in Tanakh. This is the value I'm going to quote. I'm an animal activist, and you see within Judaism there's a concept against Sar Balei Chaim, right? So they take a broad ethical statement like that. What happens is that one of the things that first hits you is that what you find so many ways is, as much as you find a statement in one way somewhere within Jewish liturgy, you find a statement of another way within Jewish liturgy. And the fact is that what you usually find is that an ethic is often presented in a vacuum, like a broad vacuum. But when you step back and see the whole picture, you find that there's a bunch of ethics, each one presented in its own vacuum, seeming to be like a 100% value, but they are in conflict with each other. Okay? So, for example, if you look at the book of Yonah, in the book of Yonah, you have the end of the book. It's very clear cut that Yonah is upset. He saved Nineveh and so forth, and God basically makes a very strong universalistic statement. He says basically, they're also my creatures, and I'm happy I saved human beings, right? I mean, I saved a city made up of a lot of human beings, and therefore a very strong universalistic statement that seems to imply the absolute equality of all human beings. Okay? In the book of Yonah, it seems very straightforward that, and this is is presented in the book, and that why did Yonah run away and so forth. But if you actually read the book, I mean, the argument that it's given for why Yonah ran away is because he was concerned for nationalistic reasons. But the fact is that in the book, it just seems he didn't want to do it, and he didn't really care about the Ninevites. And then God says in the end, listen, they're also my creatures, you should care about them. So Yonah is presented as a strong statement of universalism. Okay? So people who present the universal, if they're strong universalists, will quote the book of Yonah. Great. Super. And Yonah itself is presented in a pristine, vacuum type of way. Here is the value. Black and white presented. And that's the way, what you find throughout Torah, is the way values are generally presented. Pristine, perfect, unidimensional, unquestioned sources. Right? This is black, this is white. And therefore, when you come across a statement that says, keep Shabbos or you die, it's a very powerful statement that says, this is right to keep Shabbos, it's an ethic, and if you don't, you're deserving of the death penalty. That tells you how powerful a statement it is. This is really wrong for you not to keep Shabbos, and it's presented in a vacuum type of way. The point is, though, is that all these statements, each one of them is presented in this sort of like way, but then you put them all together and you wait a second. How does A jive with B? On one hand, yes, the book of Yonah seems to be very strongly universal, but on the other hand, there are many, many other statements that are found in Tanakh which seem to be very, very nationalistic and don't have that same universal concept. Okay? In other words, what you're faced with is, a lot of times you have black and white statements, but the fact is, and when it's presented, it's pretty black and white, but when you step back, what you then encounter is hundreds of black and white statements that somehow can't coexist as black and white statements. It just doesn't work. And then the question arises, okay, so how do I deal with the coexistence of what seemingly are contradictory values? And that's where you start running into problems. Like, for example, that book of Yonah seems to imply that there's a universal concept of caring about human beings. So how do you get this law that says that you can't save a non-Jew on Shabbos? A non-Jew is also a human being. Right? So Jew is different, but you see from Yonah, Jew is not different. Right? So how do you deal with it? And that's usually what creates a lot of the dynamic of investigating it. Like, for example, and you go through a lot of the Aguna situation. Yeah, the way Aguna is presented is very much like a black and white concept. She's married woman cannot remarry, therefore she is totally has to be alone because she's married. On the other hand, there's a concept that, well, wait a second, the person, the individual is still alone, because whatever the benefits are of marriage, she doesn't have that relationship. And there's a value in that relationship. So how do you reconcile the two? So what happens is, in many, many ways, is you start getting into this dialectic of dealing between this value and that value. And usually it leads to a tension of development. Okay? Like, for example, I'll give you another example in terms of women studying Torah. Okay? And this is an example that I saw brought down. She was it's an article about women studying Torah by a rabbi I know, but anyways, it's in Journal of Halacha and Contemporary Society. But he points out the difference between the Satmar Rav and Rabbi Soloveitchik on women studying Torah, especially Gemara. Says the fact is, he points out that both of the he basically says both the Satmar Rav and Rabbi Soloveitchik had the exact same sources, and there were two sources that he focused on. Two sources that on one hand seem to imply that there's a real value in women studying Torah, and the other source seems to imply it's really problematic for women to study Torah. Okay? So one source, the Gemara says, in the time of Chizkiyahu, the little boys and the little girls all knew the details of the laws of Tumah and Tara, of ritual purity. Now, in order to know the details of the laws of ritual purity, you had to be pretty learned. And the Gemara says that the boys and girls in the time of Chizkiyahu knew the details of this law. So that seems to imply that men and women both studied pretty intensely. On the other hand, there's another Gemara that says specifically, you should not, if you teach women Torah, right? It's like teaching them foolishness, because they can't handle whatever it is. They can't handle whatever. Or they're teaching them licentiousness. Okay, whatever. So the point is how do you reconcile these two Gemaras? So basically, he says this was really the issue of Rabbi Soloveitchik and the Satmar Rav. And the disagreement they had is which one of these two sources to take as the major one and which one to take as the minor one. Which one to give the greater validity to and which one to give greater weight to, and so forth. Or as they say, which is the ikar and which is the tefel, which is the essence and which is the secondary. It says the Satmar Rav took the statement that says you shouldn't teach women Torah as the major one. Therefore, he had to reconcile and come to some understanding of the Gemara that says why these little girls knew these laws. I forget his answer, but basically that was his approach to try and maintain women shouldn't learn Torah. It says Rabbi Soloveitchik did exactly the opposite. He said the big thing is the essential one is the fact that women knew enough to study, and then he tried to explain the other one in a way it was minor, contrary to the major one. Says that really is a methodology throughout ethics, but what you're left with is if you took every statement by itself, okay, in a vacuum, you'd say here is a statement of Jewish law, or here's a statement of Jewish ethics, and it would be very like prime and unquestioned and stated in a way that seems to be pretty straightforward and clear and black and white. It's only when you recognize there's a bunch of statements like that that are in contradiction to each other, then you have to step back and say, oh, how do I try and reconcile it? Now here's where you're left with the idea here. So the point is, why is the Chumash presented, or why does Torah present itself in that way? So what you're left with is, and this is why I call theoretical ethics, that there are times where, when you come across a theoretical, pristine ethic, you're supposed to take it as black and white. You're supposed to say, hey, there is this black and white general ethic that you're supposed to incorporate as pretty much of a basic, articulated, straightforward ethic. And you sit there and say, okay, there's a value here. There's a value here. And the fact is when you come across a statement that says that for doing these laws you should be executed, even Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon understood that there was a value in that statement. That statement was telling you how significant this law was. How theoretically violation of this law should be met with the death penalty, because on some level it's a very, very significant idea. And every time you read the statement by itself, it's to remind you of the ethic. On the other hand, when you actually have to work in the realm of ethics, you have to recognize that these pristine ethical statements are themselves found in conflict, and therefore you have to work them out practically. How do you bring these theoretical statements down to practical solutions to actually apply in the real world?
One second.
Yeah.
Give me an example of Egel HaZahav.
Mm-hmm.
Just forget the Ten Commandments. Don't do a statue. Don't pray for a statue. But with Egel HaZahav, what Hashem want to do? Destroy them.
Mm-hmm.
What Moses did, he tried to convince Hashem not to do it because, after all, it doesn't look good. So Hashem agreed with him. So I think even you have a theoretical rule or ethic, you cannot apply to a condition that exists in specific time. Because every time the conditional changes, and therefore this absolute rule has to be adjusted to the time. That's my understanding.
Or the situation.
The point is the reason you're able to do that is because there's another ethic that informs upon you to make you consider the specific situation. See, in that situation, it's not just Moshe says it doesn't look good. Okay? Moshe's argument is, first of all, the Egel HaZahav is a very difficult case in the first place, because what exactly he did wrong, how many people actually worshipped it, what was the whole nation held responsible, there were a lot of problems. But Moshe's argument was also a theoretical ethic. He said, what was your point in taking the people out of Egypt? It was to show that there's a God in the world. Okay? And to try and come across that people would start accepting God. If you take out the Jewish people and kill them here, what will it do in terms of your original ethical objective to bring God into the world and make the world recognize God? So what Moshe is basically saying is that in every situation, the situation is that the theoretical ethic meets another theoretical ethic, and it's that clash that's happening in that situation. See, let me give you another example. And I'm going to give you the example of euthanasia. Okay? Okay, because someone asked me to speak about euthanasia. Okay. The law seems to be pretty straightforward. Euthanasia is murder. So therefore, a life is a life, and you can't lessen someone's life although they're in great pain. Okay, that seems to be a pretty strong ethical perspective. The point is, though, if you actually look in the law, there happens to be another ethic. The other ethic is concern for pain. And the fact is that the idea of a person staying in pain is also a problem to someone with sensitivity. So what happens is you have what you confront is a black and white ethical statement that says this is life, and life is significant, and without any type of moderation of that statement. No statement that says, well, an elderly person's life is less significant. No, no, no. Life is significant, period, black and white, and ending life is murder, period. Great. On the other hand, then you have another ethic. The other ethic is one of being sensitive to pain and trying to alleviate another person's pain and trying to deal with the aspect of leaving someone in a painful situation is problematic. So how do you reconcile those two ethics? And the point is don't play down those ethics. Don't try and turn around and say, yeah, life of an 85-year-old person is not equal to life of... No, life is life. Don't try and play around, oh, pain, oh, it's not so bad, the person who's 80 doesn't feel the pain anymore, and don't try and play that down. Pain is pain, you should try and alleviate pain. Life is life, you should try and keep someone alive. What do you do when they're in conflict? Okay? Yeah?
DNR.
Yeah, so the fact is that's one answer. So one answer is
do not necessitate the order that's given when you are at the very latest stages.
But the fact is that's already an answer. That's an answer that's given by some poskim, not an answer by other poskim. But the point of the matter is what you're faced with is this conflict of two pristine ethics, and then you try to have to balance out these two concepts. So one way of doing it is by there's different approaches, but the fact is what I like to point out is that there is a statement in the Talmud that says "Tov v'rofim l'gehenim," the best doctors go to hell. Okay, now the way that's usually understood is that the best doctors go to hell because they're arrogant. Because if you're a really, really good doctor, you think you did it, you don't thank God for giving you the wisdom to do it, and that's where you're going to go to hell. That's a classic interpretation of a tov v'rofim l'gehenim. Okay? There's another viewpoint which I saw brought down by Rabbi Emanuel Drakovowitz in his Jewish Medical Ethics. He says a tov v'rofim l'gehenim means the good doctors go to hell. Why? Because a good doctor cares. A good doctor sees a patient in pain, and therefore he commits euthanasia, which is against the law. Which is against the law. Therefore, the best doctors, the doctors who really care, they end up in hell because they now. The fact is that seems to be a little bit of a play, but the fact is it tells you that you're supposed to, on one hand, feel the problem with having someone in pain, and then on the other hand, you're supposed to also feel the necessity of having a perception of life. And therefore, halacha constantly deals with how do you try and reconcile the two. One of them is making a distinction between what's called active euthanasia and passive euthanasia. Okay, active euthanasia means you actively do something to kill someone. Passive
suicide.
Right. Passive euthanasia meaning that you don't prevent the person from dying. Okay? Now the truth of the matter is the distinction is very hard to figure out. Like by passive euthanasia. Okay, passive euthanasia means let the person die. Don't do anything that will stop the person from naturally dying. Okay. Okay? Right? Now, the problem that exists is that what do you mean by passive euthanasia? So for example, can you withhold food? Okay? So Moshe says, most people say no, you can't withhold food, you can't withhold air. Okay? Question, what about dialysis? What if a person is going to die because they need dialysis?
Or different medications,
So the fact is can you allow this happens? The point is you get big arguments among the poskim. That's no longer passive euthanasia. That's already active because a person needs medicine and you have an obligation to treat the person which is keep them alive.
But that contradicts palliative care then.
No, palliative care is only to keep is to remove the pain without killing them.
Well, but there, even in palliative care, there's measures you can take to extend the life of the individual.
Yeah.
Those measures aren't taken.
So the point is that's a matter of whether whether the measures that are taken are defined within halacha as active or passive measures, and that's part of the case. The case is that that becomes a halachic argument in terms of how you answer the question. But the point is what I'm trying to point out is that these two pristine values, okay, of life and trying to alleviate someone's pain and trying to keep someone alive, the fact is they're presented in a vacuum in their own statement. That's what I mean by theoretical ethics. They're presented in a vacuum in their own statement as pretty pristine ethics, and then they're thrown in together to create the clash. And in creating that clash, you have different answers to try and balance them out. That's where you get into practical ethics. So Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon said, yeah, there's a pristine value execution. There's also recognition that I may not know the truth. I may make a mistake. Okay, I understand. So therefore, between that idea, you have a conflict. So therefore, and that's where you get into halachic analysis. Because the remarkable thing about halachic analysis, which people call splitting hairs and so forth, it shows you that this is the methodology you're supposed to use in trying to reconcile the two statements of the pristine ethic.
But Torah is absolute truth.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with Torah is we don't understand it thoroughly. We understand partially. So when you're talking about life, I don't think we still understand what life is all about. We don't understand why we're here. Like I can give you an argument, for example, that maybe you have to go, not you, God forbid, but someone has to go to reincarnate again to something else,
okay,
which we cannot see. So, understand, like what we see life, we see in very limited what it is about.
Right.
And how it's translated. Like, for example, when you're talking about Rabbi Akiva, which this guy goes to some high level of the scene and come back, and he can see more bigger picture than I can see, or somebody else, then we have a problem.
The fact is you're getting into a
esoteric, but
no. The point is it gets into a fundamental issue of decision making. The fact is I'm not going to compare myself to Rabbi Akiva, but the point is Rabbi Akiva's lessons or teachings are the teachings I have to deal with. And whether Rabbi Akiva meant something else or what he understood, that's between him and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The point is that I have an obligation to take Rabbi Akiva pursuant to the way I understand Rabbi Akiva. Okay? So the point is that that's my obligation. Rabbi Akiva's statement of why he wouldn't execute anyone, I have to come to some realization of his idea so I know what to do. His value in any of his statements is only in their educational value to me. What they did for him himself, that's up to him. That's between him and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. To me, Rabbi Akiva is an educational model for me. Now, does that mean I understand everything he said? No. But the point is that I have to be able to say, listen, this is the way I understand by it. This is how I understand it. And that's all my responsibility is. Now, the truth is that in a certain way, the Ramosha says that in his Hagdama to Igros Moshe. He says it in his Hagdama. He says, in terms of Torah, do I really know what God meant? No. Okay, do I know the real truth, Kalpei Shmaya? No. I only have to know the truth pursuant to my ability to know the truth. Now, is every person's ability to know the truth or conclusion equal? No. He says, listen, some person who didn't put the work in, right, reads Reader's Digest and Halacha, and says saying, I know the law, that person doesn't have a standing to have an opinion. He should have an opinion, but he doesn't have an opinion. But the point is that anyone who has an opinion, that opinion has to be an educationally valid opinion, and open that. And now, in terms of Rav Moshe, he was very adamant about this. He said, I'm going to give you my arguments, and if you disagree with my arguments, you shouldn't follow my opinions. Rav Moshe was very adamant, for example, don't go because of the fact, Rav Moshe says this. Go because you agree with me. If you don't agree with me, don't use it. Of course, when you say you don't agree with me, make sure you have a little bit of sources to back you up. Don't say you don't agree with me because you don't like it. Okay, but the point is that in that regard, we are faced with having to deal with disagreements, with viewpoints and so forth, and that's something that we have to deal with. But the point is that in a certain way, I think what I'm trying to get across is that there are theoretical ethical statements in Torah, which are pristine ethical statements, and they're always presented as pristine ethical statements. And then you deal with practical ethical statements. And the practical ethical statements is because you find that the pristine ethical statements become in conflict with each other. And then you have the halachic method that comes down to applying it, which yields to certain conclusions. But so getting back to, let's say, saving a non-Jew on Shabbos, there's some reason in ethical value of why you can't save a non-Jew on Shabbos. There's some distinction that says there's some concept in terms of Shabbos that should only apply to Jews and non-Jews, and that's a different idea. That's a different idea. I have my own thoughts on it, going back to the concept that a non-Jew is not supposed to keep Shabbos. Right? Only Jews are supposed to keep Shabbos. So there's a distinction between a Jew and non-Jew in terms of the relationship to Shabbos to begin with. And that comes down to an inherent distinction in terms of their place in the world.
So you're saying if you're taking a walk on Shabbos, and there's somebody in quicksand, you can't save them?
No. What I'm saying is there's a theoretical ethical statement that says you can't save a non-Jew on Shabbos. Okay? Good. So you're right. If a non-Jew is in quicksand, you can't do anything that's Mechal Shabbos to save him. Now, the bottom line is now comes down to practical. So almost everywhere in halacha, we basically work out a practical reason why you have to save them. Okay? So the point is that for this reason, because it will create animosity with the Jewish world, with the non-Jewish world, because you do it only with rabbinic violations. There's a whole bunch of ways of getting around it. But the point is what you end up with is that, okay, so why was this theoretical statement to begin with? Okay,
so it's there in case you need to or want to fall back on it.
No. What I'm saying is because the same way Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon, they would never execute anyone. It's because
in the state where they have death penalty in various states, and we see quite a few of these shows, or it's even in the news. So-and-so was sentenced to the death penalty, but it was commuted to 36 years in prison. It seems they're all commuted, but some are on death row. So which ones are on death row and which ones get their sentence commuted?
That's part of the analysis. But the truth is that comes into issues of practicality of playing through. But what I'm trying to say is even beyond that. When you have Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon, but the red light's still on, right? Okay. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon saying, I would never execute anyone. If you had a governor of the thing that says, I'm going to commute every death penalty in the state, he can get in a lot of trouble for doing that. He has to have reasons for it. He has to say, but if it's basically because he would be considered to be ignoring the law. So Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon, their statement is they would never execute anyone. Okay? Statement by saving a non-Jew on Shabbos is that in the end, you do save the non-Jew on Shabbos. Right? As a broad statement. So the question is, so why did it exist in the first place, that statement? So the fact is that pristine value must have an idea. It's to teach you that there's some kind of conceptual concept here, but then in practicality, you go with another value versus this value. So the point is that when you come down to it, hey, what Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Tarfon is saying is that they should really understand that if you are someone who violates Shabbos, you're deserving the death penalty. That's one thing you should really understand. And you should understand how serious Shabbos is, and then all the philosophical. But bottom line, when it comes down to the court actually carrying this out, hey, wait a second. Right? There's another value, the value of human life, the value of what you might say in terms of him eventually doing tshuva, the value of other aspects. He says maybe you should think twice before. Maybe you should not do it actually in practical aspects. But the point is, the theoretical ethic is still presented in the Torah in a pristine way, so you have it in the back of your mind. There is that ethic. In other words, even if you are Dr. Kevorkian and practicing assisted suicide and euthanasia and so forth, you should have in the back of your head that you're talking with human life and you're taking human life. Okay? In other words, there's a pristine value to human life. Okay? And the fact is that's significant. And the truth is as it works through the practical analysis, you see in halacha of this balancing between these various different ethics. Now, one other thing I wanted to point out, because I mentioned the case of Zona by Kohen, and it came up last week, and I wanted to explain something about that. Here you have a statement that says a woman who's raped by a non-Jew can never marry a Kohen. Then you sit there and say people work it out that they should marry a Kohen. So someone asked last week, why is it only if you're raped by a non-Jew? Why is it a woman who's sleeping, or not even raped by why is it only a woman who's had relations with a non-Jew is prohibited in a Kohen, but a woman who, I think the person said, who sleeps with a Jewish football team, she doesn't become a Zona. So the fact is that's where you also have to understand what the theoretical ethic in the first place is. The theoretical ethic over there is not if you sleep around. It's not if you are promiscuous. The theoretical ethic over there says if you sleep with someone you're not supposed to marry. In other words, what it says is distinction between, and this gets into concepts of incest, and is that there's a distinction between having relations with people you theoretically could marry, that you could bond with, right? Having relations with that will not make you usher and a Kohen. But if you overstep that line and have a relationship with someone that you cannot theoretically have a bonded relationship with, that you can't marry, that's where you enter into this definition of Zona. So it's a very different definition. So sometimes when you look in terms of halacha, you also have to see what that actual theoretical definition is. But what I wanted to deal with tonight was the fact that what you have existing in Jewish law is theoretical ethics, which are presented in very black and white, pristine forms. And it's out of the reality that there is conflict between these theoretical ethics that yields us to try and work through halachically to practical ethics, which comes down to the fact that we come to certain conclusions of practical ethics which seem to contradict the theoretical ethic. And usually it's because there's another theoretical ethic that is supported by this practical ethic, and what really is to tell you that when you do have this practical ethic, you should see it as a result of pristine ethics, even pristine ethics that are in conflict. And that's really reflected, I think euthanasia is an interesting aspect of it, because in Jewish law, if you ever speak to a certain, I'm not to say every posting, but certain Rabbanim, the amount of anguish that is felt in any situation of a person who's in pain, and the question coming up of what can you do to ease this person's pain, the amount of anguish that happens with Rabbanim, and I've been involved in questions like that, is you really are pulled by the ethical statements. It's a human life, and this person's suffering in pain. And in many ways, Jews are called upon to constantly remember the dialectic, constantly recognize the balancing of these different values. Then practically you have to come to a solution. Yeah.
So subsequent to reading about the story of assisted suicide in Oregon, where it's permitted, and this woman moved there supposedly to die with dignity. She, I think, had a brain tumor or some such thing.
Right.
And to her, according to the diagnosis and the end-of-life situation, she was going to die, and in a short period of time, and it was going to debilitate her tremendously and put her in an incredible amount of pain. I read an article subsequent to that on a Jewish website that talked about her situation with compassion for her. And the person who wrote the article was also diagnosed with something that was life-threatening, but recovered.
Yeah. It wasn't the same.
No, well, needless to say, it wasn't the same. It was not the same. But the point is they had a similar diagnosis where the end result was death in a short period of time, potentially with a lot of pain, and yet the Jewish point of view.
Her point was, who are you to take away what God gave?
Right.
Which, by the way, is a classic argument. Hanani ben Shradin gave that argument, so but it's a classic argument. But the fact is that
it's on the H1.
What happens is in that statement is that yes, you have it presented in a pristine statement, and that's an argument against it. On the other hand, you also find a tremendous sympathy within the sources to why someone wants that pain. See, to me, I always find it absolutely remarkable, for example, where Moshe Feinstein deals with the case of Hanani ben Shradin. Okay, and I think I might have mentioned to you guys before this. Hanani ben Shradin was being burnt alive, being to the stake. But to extend his anguish and his suffering, they wrapped first of all they wrapped the Sefer Torah around him, but they also wrapped sponges soaked in water, wool soaked in water, around his torso in order to prolong his suffering. He's being burnt alive like this. So and his students yell out to him and say, Rabbi, open up your mouth so maybe the flame will go inside you and you'll die faster. And he says, no, I cannot hasten my death. Whatever, he says, classic source against any form of euthanasia. What happens is the executioner is so enthralled with the piety of Hanani ben Shradin, he says to him, listen, if I remove the sponges and fan the flame to make it to allow you to die earlier, will you promise me Olam Haba? Okay? And the Hanani ben Shradin says yes. Okay? So the executioner fans the flame, takes off the sponges, fans the flame, and then the Hanani ben Shradin dies earlier, and then he himself jumps into the flame because he knows what's going to happen to him, because the Romans would be very upset with him for not following the game plan. So he dies execution. Okay. Then the Baskol comes out and says that both Hanani ben Shradin and the executioner are Kona Olam Haba, God Olam Haba. So I think it's Rabbi Yochanan says there are people who take the whole life to get Olam Haba, and there's people who get it within 1 hour. Okay. So the question exists: if it was prohibited for Hanani ben Shradin to hasten his own death, how is it permitted for the executioner to do it? Because he's also, as a Noachide, subject to laws of murder. So how could he do it? Okay, and not only that, he got Olam Haba for doing it. Okay. So there are different answers. One answer is presented is the executioner was in a different category because he was the executioner. Since he started the process of the act of murder, he could hasten his own act of murder without any consequences. That's one answer. Problem is, he jumps into the flame himself and commits suicide. So how can he do that? Another person. Okay. Rav Moshe Feinstein has a possibility. He says a distinction between Noahide law and Jewish law. He says theoretically, efshar, maybe, don't take this as, says maybe, that a Jew cannot commit euthanasia, but a non-Jew can. Not only that, the non-Jew could even be a mitzvah. And he says, why is this so? He says, well, because the law for Jews is derived from the Ten Commandments, from the Aseret Dibros, where it says lo tzirtzach, don't commit murder, and it seems like any type of murder. But the law for Noachides is from a verse in Parshas Noach, where it says shofer dam ha'adam. There's one who spills the blood of a human being, his own blood should be spilled. So he says, so maybe for a Noachide it's only if it's a violent type of thing. Shofer dam seems to be violent, and only when you kill against the wishes of the person being killed. In other words, for a Jew, killing against is prohibited in every possibility. For a non-Jew, maybe it's only prohibited when it's against the wishes of the person being killed. That's his possibility. Now, Rav Moshe throws that out as an efshar. Don't get me wrong. But what always hit me about it is the fact that Rav Moshe could even come up with that theory. I mean, think about it. If you think euthanasia is wrong, you think it's wrong. You have this person saying this thing on that website. Could a person like that ever come up with a distinction that says maybe Noachides yes, Jews no? It's the reason Rav Moshe could come up with that idea, and you see from his other tshuvas, is he had tremendous sensitivity to the pain of individuals. He didn't mock the euthanasia because euthanasia is awesome, right? But did he feel for the pain of a person who's going to suffer? Yes, with tremendous pain. So he felt for it. That type of maintaining those two types of concepts in your mind. In other words, I have no doubt that this woman, she's right. Maybe the person will survive because doctor says there's a radio commercial all the time being played, putting get best doctors, because my surgeon told me I was going to die. I went to best doctors, and boy, I'm still around. So the truth of the matter is there's many cases of people who told they're going to die, and they're still around. So the point is that that's an argument that says, hey, on the other hand, there are a lot of people who suffer tremendous death. And the truth is that what's the answer? Even as a secularist, when I tell someone, when I sit there and say, go to Oregon, maybe you go to another doctor. Doctors are only human. Maybe you have a solution. That's on a secular level. But in terms of balancing the values and understanding that there's a value in not seeing someone suffer in great pain, and there's a value in keeping life along, and they're contradictory, and I don't know how to reconcile it, but keeping both around. And that's why when Moshe throws out an idea, you see that he's a man who had these ideas both in his mind. And he threw out this as an answer to that question. But the point is that that's a very difficult thing to do. But that's what Judaism does. It presents very pristine theoretical ethics that make the ethics seem black and white. And then it comes across and then present. But then somehow you find in halacha that somehow come up to some conclusion, and you understand it because there's another pristine ethic that's just as black and white, that's contradictory, and you have to work it out. And you have to really work these things out. Yeah.
Curiosity. We're coming to parasha that Rivka said to Yaakov, go take the bracha before Esav. So she said, and he very funny said, so what happened if my father will curse me? She said, oh, don't worry about it. I'll take the curse. But she didn't. But the problem, she said, go lie to your father. Yeah. Take the bracha. So how you reconcile this kind of?
Yeah, I mean, the fact of the matter is that not only that, but when Esav screamed in anguish when he found out that Yaakov stole his bracha, we're being the Medrash says because of Eitz's pain that Yaakov calls them, the Jews will suffer through Eitz's descendants. But by the way, it's very clear cut that Yaakov said that Yitzchak says Gam Baruch Tirya. The truth of the matter is Yitzchak agreed with it in the end. In the end, Yitzchak said, "Hey, Yaakov, you did a good thing. I'm very happy you did the right thing. So you're right." So the point is that we live in a world with conflicting values, and that means that not everything is black and white. The fact of the matter is, you have these black and white values that exist. Then, when you talk about situations, you come to certain conclusions that this is what I have to do. But because of the fact that there are these conflicting values, you end up with, hey, not everything that, when you end up doing something, you have to recognize that there's a value you're still going to contradict. Don't think your behavior is going to be 100% okay. It's the fact of it is, it's a behavior that's even the correct behavior. Yeah, Rivka told him you had to lie. And lying isn't good. So Yaakov said, yeah, okay. Yaakov is the Ishemis. And he said, yeah, I have to do that. Okay? It's my behavior is going to be a conflict between various values. But the value that I should get the bracha overrode the value of telling the truth in this case. But the value of telling the truth is still existent. The practical value, the practical ethical solution does not become the pristine ethical solution. It becomes the practical solution. But recognize that a lot of times you're going to have conflicts in those values. And then when you think you're doing the right thing, it's right, but recognize that, hey, there still may be a negative consequence because there still may be a value that is somehow ignored. And the truth is that if you're involved in a euthanasia case, if you basically say, and I know this from Rabbanim, when they sit there and say, there's nothing you can do, you can't hasten this death, they say with a tremendous amount of pain because they know that the person's going to be in pain. On the other hand, if they sit there and say, okay, you don't have to do this, they understand, wait a second, it means that you may be hastening the end of someone's life. It's always a very, and by the way, that's usually what gets me in those situations, is that the statement that comes out, this woman in Oregon, it comes out like, it's the right thing to do. You should be feeling the remarkable anguish of any action in that regard. The same way with that woman came across and said, she's making a good point. Someone might live, people live, but you know something? People don't live in anguish. You know, I'll tell you a story. I usually get upset when people present things in sort of like these nice, pristine ways when it comes down to practicality. There was a flight from Baltimore that went down in the Bay of Fundy a few years ago. Okay? There was a family in Baltimore that was supposed to be on that flight. And one of the kids got sick. They had to cancel their tickets. Baruch Hashem, they weren't on that flight and they didn't die. So people were going around telling the story, Hashgacha Prati, they were saved, and so forth and so forth. And the fact is what about all the other people who died? No, but everyone died. So you see, and you have to understand that the kid got sick, right? So you think it's bad that the kid got sick, but in the end, it was really for a good reason, so bad things only happen because in the end it's going to be good, and you see the people were saved from not being on the flight. In a very simplistic manner. And people were going around telling the story, you see, Kodesh Baruch was involved, and Hashgacha, and okay. So then I heard another story that involved the same flight. It seemed to be a guy who was visiting his parents in Toronto, who was scheduled to be on that flight from Baltimore. And the flight from Toronto to Baltimore to make that flight got cancelled. So the guy was stuck. How was he going to make that flight? So he found out that there was a flight from Baltimore in Buffalo that he theoretically, if he got crazy, could possibly get on the flight from Buffalo. So his father said, listen, let's try making the flight. And his father drove like crazy to make that flight in Buffalo. And he made the flight. The guy made the flight in Buffalo, got on the flight from Baltimore that went down the Bay of Fundy. Okay? So people would tell me this story about how this family. I said, let me tell you another story, Hashgacha Pratit. There was a guy here, right, trying to make, and his father, so imagine the way his father was driving back from Buffalo. I did it for my son. I felt remarkably great. We made the flight. He must have felt great. We made the flight. Right? That's Hashgacha Pratit. And when a person would tell me that story, and I'd say, here's another story of Hashgacha Pratit, what do you think happened? All of a sudden, I think the person was ready to kill me. Right? I said, what are you talking about? If you believe in Hashgacha Pratit, then don't go believing in Hashgacha Pratit one way. It's a whole story. So believe in it or don't believe in it. That's up to you. Okay? But if you're going to believe in it, believe in God's hand the way it works. Now, deal with it. The reason I'm pointing that out is because in so many ways we present things in a simplistic fashion that seem to imply black and white values and so forth and so forth. Things are much more complex. Things yield tension between values and so forth and so forth. And I really believe that's essential in Jewish law. It's essential in Jewish law to understand that the Torah presents ethics in pristine black and white statements. People like to quote that ethic in the pristine sense because it supports their own ethic. I have ethic B, I'll quote a pasuk, and you see the Torah supports my ethic B. The point of the matter is what they don't recognize is the Torah may have another statement that presents a different ethic. And the fact is what you see from halachic analysis is that constant balancing of trying to work with those conflicting ethics to come up with a practical ethic. And that practical ethic is never, a pure, pristine type of statement which says it's sort of like you have to maintain the conflict and the ideas and work it out and what's being presented. Anyways.
One more question.
Yeah.
What about miracles?
What about miracles?
Some people get the miracle,
Ask the Kodesh Baruch Hu about it. I have no idea.
You don't have that.
That's God's business.